right. Good morning, everybody. I'm Emma Belcher, President of Ploughshares. We are the largest funder that is singly focused on reducing the nuclear weapons threat. I'm delighted that you've all joined us this morning, particularly at this very early hour. We hope you've had some coffee, but we do intend to have this as a very lively discussion, so hopefully we'll all keep you awake even if you haven't made it to the caffeine bar yet. So what you're going to hear today is perhaps a little bit different from what you might be used to hearing yesterday at the conference and what you might hear later on today. It's going to be a bit different in substance and in tone, but we really think it's a critical component that really complements nicely the substantive issues that are under discussion over these 2 days. And that is the importance of changing the narrative and using culture as a way to create the demand for the types of nuclear policies that are going to be safer and make us all more secure. And it's really about pushing back against the narrative, the dangerous narrative, that we need more and more nuclear weapons to keep us safe, that nuclear weapons are worth the expenditure. Before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to say just a few words about why Ploughshares is so invested in this particular issue of changing the narrative. We've really recognised that we can only be successful in policy change, that the ideas that are created by many in this room can only be successful if we have constituents that support those ideas of safer nuclear weapons policies. And I think a number of us, many of you in this room, have been up and had meetings on Capitol Hill trying to persuade members of Congress to make the right decisions when it comes to nuclear policy. And they say, well, I agree with you, but my constituents don't seem to care about it. I'm not hearing from them. So I'm going to focus on those other issues where I'm feeling more pressure. And what we find is that this is one of the root problems of preventing us from making more progress on stopping the arms race that we have embarked upon and reversing that and making the world safer and more secure. And the reason for that is because those who own the narrative that more and more weapons keep us safe, particularly in the United States, they are pushing increased spending, weapons arms racing, and fear-mongering, quite frankly. And their narrative supports the idea that nuclear weapons keep us safe. Now, we know that Americans have a complex relationship with nuclear weapons. They overwhelmingly prefer a world without them. Roughly 77% of Americans prefer a world without nuclear weapons. But the problem is they don't see it as feasible or even likely. They see Russia and China arming, and they believe that because of that, the United States needs to do so as well. So they're seen as a necessary evil, and unfortunately, by a 5-to-1 margin, Americans say that nuclear weapons are an asset to our security. But the research that we've done finds that the public doesn't realise the urgency of the moment that we're in, how nuclear risks are arising, and how this affects them and could affect them personally. And maybe most importantly, they see nuclear weapons as tools of governments and leaders, far too secret and too complex for everyday citizens to have a say. So they're tuned out. And they're not contacting members of Congress about this issue. But I'm here, and we're all here, because we actually think we can win on this issue. It's critical that from Ploughshares' perspective, we're investing in this work because shaping public understanding and political will around nuclear threats is critical for long-term change. By collaborating with our partners, many in this room, on narrative strategies, we can shift the conversation from technical jargon that's quite frankly inaccessible to human impact, making the issue urgent, accessible, and actionable for broader audiences. We do think we can win this argument because we know the public is thirsty and hungry for solutions that prioritise safety and common sense, and we're equipping trusted messengers with tools to meet that moment. So Ploughshares and NTI just released a new narrative guide that was developed with field input and nationwide focus groups. The guide offers concrete strategies to counter this state of play. And we hope there's also further collaboration across organisations, partners and individuals on weaving in this narrative framework to our work. The more we can work together on shifting the narrative and the way we speak about this issue publicly, the more we adapt the lessons of the narrative guide, the more the impact we can have collectively. So we encourage those who are heads of organisations to use the narrative, empower your staff with the tools in the narrative guide to imbue through their work, and use the checklists that we've provided as a way to cross-check materials that your team's producing and ensure that those from across your organisation and from communications to policy staff had these resources accessible to them. And in fact, everyone can leave here today with a takeaway, a tangible takeaway. You can pick up a brochure and narrative checklist from our partners at NTI. I believe they're out in the lobby area. And these are easy resources to pin up on your desk and have on hand when you're writing anything from an external message to your subscriber base, a letter to mobilise grassroots groups. I know that I actually have one that I use in my public speaking. So let's get to the discussion. I'm joined today by three experts for what I think will be a terrific discussion, and they represent a range of angles on addressing this issue. First is Mac Hamilton, who's Program Director for Peace and Security at Rethink Media. She brings enormous expertise on how we can shift the narrative on nuclear weapons in the media and seize those opportunities to seed our messaging on a proactive basis. Second, Elise Rowan, Deputy Vice President for Communications at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And Elise has been co-leading the work of NTI's Critical Mass project, which is designed to build critical mass of public support for nuclear risk reduction and disarmament, using the levers of narrative change, cultural organising and campaigns. And then finally, we have Jason Rzepka, who is leading cultural strategist. And he's had fascinating experience shifting narratives and building cultural impacts at MTV, Every Town for Gun Safety, and on behalf of many other social causes. So I'm going to turn it over to ask each of them to give you a little bit more of an insight into them and their personal reasons for doing this work by asking what brings you to this work and what convinced you that narrative and culture are key ingredients to changing policy. So Mac, over to you.
Amazing. Well, thanks so much for having us here. Maybe next year we'll be on, at the big stage, but lovely to be with you all bright and early. What brought me to this work? In 2005, I was in high school. It was the height of the Darfur genocide. I was really just a high school theater kid who had some friends doing some music stuff. And I had some friends who were in a Battle of the Bands fundraiser that was a fundraiser for Darfuri refugees in Chad. And headlining that event was a survivor of the Sudanese Civil War. It was my first time interacting with genocide in a modern sense, right? I'd read maybe some children's novels about the Holocaust. I'd engaged in some ways, but it felt very historical to me. All those movies were in black and white, right? It felt like we had moved forward as a people, and a lot of that was our global institutions that were formed after World War II. But really, I think what engaged me was listening to that survivor's story. It was hearing the harrowing tale of someone who had survived firsthand a genocide, lived to tell the story. And it motivated me, right? It brought me into a community of activists. This was at a time when George Clooney was talking about genocide and getting arrested on Capitol Hill. It was a time when I think MTV was actually quite involved. There was a student at Brown University who went over and was able to go with MTV. to go visit the refugee camps. All that to say, there was a community for me to join as a high schooler, right? There was a moment that I could be activated and join a community of people who cared about the things that I was learning to care about. And I think my main takeaways as I was reflecting on what drove me into this space over time was that the historical education matters, that we have to do that historical education, that community really matters. It mattered that my high school government teacher helped put this event together, started a club, brought us to DC to lobby. Like, that is really what allowed me to enter the space. That first-person storytelling is really critical to getting people engaged and involved. And that having opening spaces throughout society to engage with global issues is absolutely vital, right? If George Clooney and Don Cheadle and Angelina Jolie and, you know, all those really big names had not been engaging in this topic, it would never have reached my high school on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, right? In small town, public school, et cetera. So, yeah, I think that's what brought me in. I found Nukes by accident, but I think the values and those lessons remain.
Fantastic. Jason, what brought you to this kind of work and to working at MTV and to believing that narrative change is possible on nuclear weapons?
Well, this is uncanny, and we didn't coordinate this ahead of time, but Darfur was a catalytic event for me because I started my career as a communications professional. I thought I'd be a flack my whole life. I was good at placing stories, and I wound up at MTV, and all of a sudden, I'm there helping to publicize our efforts at MTVU to give a megaphone to college students to help end a genocide half a world away. And I didn't vote in the first 2 presidential elections that I could have. I'd never volunteered. I never donated any money. I would say, skeptical of activist appeals. Like, they never really landed for me, in part because of the messaging. Like, I remember in college seeing a guy outside the student union saying, "Join with me to end hunger." And I'd pass this guy all the time, and I'd be like, "You're not ending hunger. You and I together are not ending hunger. Hunger's part of the human condition." And it was just like the messaging didn't land for me until I was a part of something where these kids were using all these new tools at their disposal to really try and accelerate and have an impact on something happening a half a world away. And it was really at that time that I realized that there was a whole new way to approach activism. There was a whole new set of tools that we could put to work. And I ended up running the social impact team at MTV for many years across the whole portfolio of work we did around sexual health, mental health, getting young people registered to vote and turning them out. So it kind of opened my eyes to the possibilities. And I think once you kind of are converted and kind of move into that world and have the opportunity to do that work, I took that privilege really seriously and kind of devoted the rest of my career to trying to harness those approaches and those tools to accelerate change that help people live better lives now. And after a long time at MTV, I decided that it felt like I was cheating because I had such a big megaphone, such a big platform. Anything I did there was going to be seen by a lot of people. And I made a conscious choice to leave and see how those tools would apply in a very different context. And I joined Everytown for Gun Safety a couple months after it was founded, when Mike Bloomberg stepped into the breach and said we need to do more to address this unique American epidemic of gun violence. And the charge there in the beginning was, can you get celebrities to tweet about this? Like, that was literally what they asked for. And I was like, yeah, and maybe we need a cultural strategy, because they had tried. I mean, this is an issue where a lot of the popular policy proposals poll at 90%. Right? 90% of Americans support, universal background checks, things like this. Put it on a ballot initiative, you get 47%. What's missing there? We weren't meeting people and engaging people through culture where they live their lives. Just waking them up every day saying, call your congressperson. You can only do that so much. So this is where I really started to understand how you could use culture as a tool, as one of the main ways to engage people on issues inclusive of narrative change. And really since then, as I run my own consultancy, I just try and parachute into tough issues like nuclear disarmament or pick the issue and see how much of that I can apply and then how much we need to innovate and experiment with to try and make change. So that's why I'm here.
Terrific. Well, thanks for leaving MTV and parachuting into nuclear weapons. Elise, let me come to you. Was Darfur also something that activated you, or how did you come to the issue?
It wasn't, actually. So I'll be honest. So I knew I wanted to be in this city. I wanted to be studying foreign policy, working on foreign policy. And when I was applying to graduate school, someone was like, you need a specific niche or angle. You can't just be like, I want to study foreign policy. So I subscribed to Foreign Affairs, and I read an article in 2008 called The Logic of Zero. And I was fascinated. I had never thought too deeply about nuclear weapons before, but just it seemed like such a worthy challenge to think about how we could go from a world where there were weapons that could destroy the planet, hundreds of times over, to working together in a community to do something big like that. So that was what I set my sights on. I came here, I was like, I can change it if I decide. I get there and I decide that's not what I want to do, but it turns out it was very much what I wanted to do. And so I did all the different internships around DC, the Hill, the State Department, think tanks. And I was in the field for a while, early career. It was like the Obama Prague speech days, like things were good. We were feeling good. We were making progress. And I started to feel a little disillusioned with being in these rooms where it felt like people were competing over who knew more about, some arms control agreement talks or who was in the room before. And I kind of thought, like, aren't we trying to do something together, like something important? And I got a little disillusioned. I left for a while, worked on another tough issue, but I came back. And I think I was pulled back partly because I became a parent in the intervening years. And I thought, this is too important of an issue to sit on the sidelines of again. I want to be back in the game. But also, I was thrilled to see that in the intervening time, I think NTI, the organization that I'm with now, its evolution towards narrative and culture had been happening, and I think that's exactly what we needed. I think I mentioned the Prague speech days, and I think we all at NTI have realized that you can have the leader of the American president on board, excited to enact the change that we all want to see, and it can only take you so far. So without that demand signal, without that public demand, we can't get all the way there. We watched what happened with the Iran deal, a historic achievement, these swings. And so we need the sustained public demand that can only come, as Jason said, I think through culture and narrative and, at a high level. People don't care about ICBMs. They don't care about, a lot of the wonky things. Everyday people want to know, am I safe? Am I secure? Are my loved ones safe and secure? And so that's what's gotten me back into the game and back into the work.
Fantastic. Well, we're glad you came back, despite some of those challenging dynamics we're very familiar with. So I think we've talked about the importance of culture and supporting decisions being made. I think I want to address now an elephant in the room, which is, I know Elise, when Plowshares and NTI were doing this narrative work, we started in a time maybe a year or so ago, which was a certain world. And now we're in a very different place. And so what I want to do is start with Mac and say, what does this current political climate mean for this kind of culture and narrative change work?
Such a good question, and it really, sitting in panels yesterday, I felt like this was the elephant in the room, right? The conversations that I heard on the main stage, no one touched on the US's sliding into fascism, what do we do with that? How do we grapple with that as we're talking about nuclear weapons issues? So I want to start by saying this is the moment we're in. We are living in a country where we're going to have a fascist regime in charge of the second largest nuclear arsenal in the world. That's pretty sobering. We're in a pretty important moment. We're not the only country to go through fascism and authoritarianism, however, and we can learn from civil society in other countries who have faced authoritarianism, who are continuing to face authoritarianism, who are acting together to fight authoritarianism. I think that's maybe the number one thing that I want to open with. Two, I think one of the points made earlier on public opinion, actually, Jason, you said this. We know where public opinion is on nuclear weapons issues, and it hasn't actually moved policy super far in the direction that we want it to. We have a huge democracy gap, right? So as we're thinking about fascism and authoritarianism, I think we need to think about nuclear weapons as a major democracy issue, both domestically here in the United States, right? Foreign policy is one of the least democratic areas of engagement. Although, I mean, we see in gun violence and other spaces that public opinion does not actually change policy. But it's also a global democracy question, right? I think what interests me the most about nuclear weapons is that we have the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, making policy for the rest of the world, right? The post-World War II order that many of us feel like is our only hold on stability has not been so good for most of the world, right? And that is because of nuclear weapons. So those are some of the concepts that I'm thinking about. The stakes feel really, really high. I think we know that in the next 4 years, there will be really high salience moments involving nuclear weapons. And I think the most important thing for us to do is for us to be ready for those high salience moments, for us to have ways for the public to tap in and engage when nuclear weapons are actually in the news and make these democracy connections. I don't know that we're going to wake up and overnight nuclear weapons are going to be the movement issue, but they certainly intersect with other movement issues, and I know we're going to get into that soon too.
Terrific. Does anyone else have anything to add on the current moment?
Just the one thing I'll say is just tying it back to the definition of culture. Because like when I transitioned out of MTV, I started going to Policy Place, and what is culture? Like I had to be clear on that. So two really important definitions that I hold dear, and it ties back into this question, is the prevailing beliefs, values, and behaviors of a people at a point in time. The prevailing. There's a tug of war. There's a push and pull. Oftentimes oppositional values, beliefs, and behaviors. Some set of those prevail. That's our culture at that moment in time. So that's what we're in right now, is a push and pull, a tug of war around different worldviews. And typically, the winner is the side that tells a better story. And that's not talking points, and that's not statistics. That's telling a better story, because that's how people understand the world around them. So I think that's the moment we're in, and I think the onus is on whatever side you identify on to tell a better story, because that's often what prevails.
So Jason, let me push on that a little and ask you, what are those audiences that we need to reach, and how do we reach them? What do we do to reach them and organize them at this point in time?
Well, the interns in this room have forgotten more about nuclear disarmament than I'll ever know, so I wouldn't push me on audiences. I think you've got an incredible resource here to go there. I think it's really getting clear, though, on the theory of change. Is like these audiences need to be moved here to achieve this outcome. One of the things that I struggle with on this issue in terms of public engagement is the agency question, because it does come back to these like 9 dudes who hold all this power. And I know it's not sole authority everywhere, but ultimately there's 9 people in this world who have a disproportionate amount of power, and you can't trick people into giving them agency. Like there has to be a clear connection between if I do X, then Y happens. And different issues approach it in different ways, and that's not to be fatalistic about it. I'm just saying, like, you have to be honest about it. So, but I would cede the floor on the key audience question.
So let's go to Elise.
Sure.
The audiences.
Sure. I think, and this actually ties back to the last question as well, is so our research has found that, so I want to echo, I think, what Emma said at the beginning, which is we can reach a supermajority of Americans. Like, a supermajority of Americans are with us from a values perspective, from a core values about what this issue is about and what they believe. And our research shows, and so I want to be clear that we're not trying to boil the ocean and like reach every single person. So we classify we have kind of a base. We use the psychographic model where we classify people into 4 different buckets. And there's like the don't tread on me's, there's the people power, which is sort of the natural base of people who believe in social justice and progressive ideas. Then there's if you say so, people a little like skeptical, tough, kind of questioning authority, but generally believe that they should have the right to make their own choices in their lives. And the tough cookies, these are like rule followers, older women, kind of like there's a, church going, there's a religious component. And so when we've done our research, we've identified that there are 5 core values that this movement is associated with, that is like in the DNA of nuclear risk reduction and disarmament, that connects with those people. And so those are courage, optimism, to believe a better world is possible, agency, the power to control your own destiny, sustainability, focus on a future and the health and sustainability and well-being of the planet, and security, the ability to be safe from the threat of harm. And so when we think about who we need to mobilize, we have kind of the narrative guide that Emma mentioned is specifically targeted to reach those people. And there's different messages, even at a message level, that we've gone and said, okay, well, this democracy argument on, as Jason mentioned, sole authority, that ties directly to democracy and the democracy community. And that works best with this segment, et cetera. So I think I also want to mention, just when we think about the change we want to see, young people are living with a nuclear arsenal that they did not ask for, that they are left with. The modernization decisions that are being made right now will have consequences for, in some cases, their grandchildren. And so when we think about who we need to, I feel like in some ways that's not a very unique answer, but who we need to reach and organize, I think, especially because young people weren't involved in duck and cover, et cetera, figuring out how to connect to this new generation, make it salient. And I am very compassionate knowing that Gen Z has lived through crisis after crisis, and there are a lot of things to be worried about these days. But I do believe that we can re-engage that critical population through culture.
Fantastic. I'm going to just come to Jason on that particular thing and then come back to Mac. Jason, how do we make nuclear weapons more relevant to people's lives? Elise has sort of articulated the different groups of people that we'd be trying to move. Please go and take a copy of the NTI report. The executive summary as well outlines this very clearly. But Jason, how do you make this more relevant to people's lives? How do we make it connect with issues that people care about?
Well, I think the last piece is important. How do we connect it to other issues that they care about? Because when I first came to this work, it was a little bit daunting because it feels so remote and it feels so removed. And certainly everybody lives with this existential threat and dread, but at an agency level, like a lot of the issues I've worked on are connected to choices you make on a daily basis, and a lot of the issues that we see get a lot of mainstream attention are those where like your daily choices dictate the direction of that, and this issue is very different in that way. So I think we would be wise to study other issues that have more of like a structural and power dimension as opposed to a personal decision-making dimension. So like health issues, how we treat each other. Like this is a lot of the campaigning you've seen on issues that really come to the fore are more in that vein. But there are other issues that are much more structural. So I've really been compelled by the kind of economic argument is when people see and realize how much money is being poured into this quietly, behind the scenes, and all the other pressing needs that we have in the country. Like I've always found that, like for me personally, enraging, and like I've seen from the work you guys have done when people learn that fact, like it charges them up. So, I think at the core though. If we don't attack that 5 to 1, 5 to 1, think it makes us safer, I don't know that you're going to get, I don't know that you're ever going to get hundreds of thousands or millions of people in the street, but I think unless you attack that core foundational component, I think it gets really hard to do anything else. So for me, that comes back to storytelling. And, I was thinking on it this morning, like if you wanted to convince people that sharks were dangerous, like, would you come with a whole battery of statistics around the increase in shark attacks off the coast of South Africa? Or would you make Jaws? You'd make Jaws, because that would be a story that would terrify people for years. And I'm not saying to freak people out, but I'm saying the power of great storytelling. And we've seen it, right? We've seen it on this issue with the day after. So, like, I think there's so much that this issue can actually learn from its legacy, from its pedigree, the history of what has been accomplished on this before. And I think there are a lot of those techniques and tactics that could be dusted off and used for a new generation.
Fantastic. So there are things to learn from our past, and I think when we talk to people about the fact that we have had a dramatic reduction of nuclear weapons since the height of the Cold War, people start to think something's possible. So it is about telling those stories, making that progress visible. But Mac, you work on a range of issues, not just nuclear. What are you seeing from other issue areas and other movements? Who's doing well and why are they doing well? And what are their lessons that we can learn and that we can all take as we do our work and fight for better nuclear policies?
Absolutely. It's a great question. Some of the other spaces I work in, one of those spaces is the Palestine space, the Palestine solidarity space. Noting that there's a lot of young people in this room, I suspect that if you were on a campus recently, you may have been engaged in this issue. I think something that I am thinking about is how important it is to see each other taking action visibly, right? Especially really if we're going back to this moment of fascism and authoritarianism, we're in a moment where people are afraid. We're all waiting for this EO to drop to target climate organizations, right? Many of our organizations are multi-issue. Many of us work on climate. I think the climate movement is the movement that we as the nuclear community have thought, like, why doesn't climate get us? Why can't we get some of that climate money, right? Like, nuclear weapons would cause a catastrophic climate crisis, right? And that's who's about to be targeted, maybe not this week because the Pope died, but like soon with an executive order, and that's gonna blow back at us, right? And so if I'm thinking about who we need to learn from, who we need to work with and bridge build with, it's the brave people who have been speaking up against authoritarianism in the Biden administration. The crackdown on college campuses in a Democratic administration that is having repercussions in this moment where we're losing our deepest held, most treasured institutions. So I would say I'm deeply inspired by the bravery I've seen on college campuses. It's not surprising that student movements are where you came from and where I came from, because it's young people who have a pulse on the culture. They're the folks who are bridge building across the world, really. And that's something that when we're in more elite research-based policy spaces, and we're not talking to the people on the ground who are actually, experiencing the harm, we're missing something really critical. and I think where I've seen the nuclear weapons space do really well in terms of engaging grassroots is on RICA. It's on issues related to nuclear weapons and the harm caused by nuclear weapons, whether it's nuclear weapons use, as in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where the 80th anniversary of which is this year, which we should all be thinking about how to mobilize people and resources around. Because if we miss that moment, that's our moment, right? This is our field, and that is, if we miss the 80th anniversaries, we're missing something huge. So yeah, all that to say, I think the movement for Palestinian rights and freedom is what I would say.
Thanks, Meg. Certainly talking about the issue of climate change and the connection with nuclear, I've found over the last few years as I've travelled around the world and been at different forums where issues of global significance are discussed, nuclear weapons aren't really present. And I think that has been changing over the last few months. But it strikes me that once we do get in the room and we talk to people about the cost of nuclear weapons and the way in which, the $190 billion being spent globally a year, are there better ways to support things like sustainable development goals, human rights, climate change, other issues that people so desperately care about? I see the light bulbs go off for people. And when you say that even a small nuclear exchange could derail all of the progress being made on other issues people care about so desperately, that starts to sink in. So I think part of what we need to do is be much more visible about the realities of nuclear weapons, make it not an issue that is just talked about by people deep inside the Pentagon, but an issue that everyday people have a say in and have agency in. So, Elise, as someone who's worked with Ploughshares on narrative change, are they narrative change and culture long-term strategies? Are there short-term gains, though? And what indicators are you going to be looking for to show that we're making progress?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's definitely a long game, and I think none of us have illusions that this is going to be a quick fight. But I think there's a potential for short-term gains. And when I think about, so back to the 5-to-1, I think that, and telling a better story, I think that there are ways that we can erode that 5-to-1, we can move back on our side. And when Max said, you mentioned RICA, I think another place that we can do really well and make some big gains are, it's a tough environment out there when we have to respond to the news of the day. Russia did this, China did this, et cetera. But when we talk about the system that we've built, a system that depends on machines and people working perfectly every single day, and the times that has almost gone south, the many times, the close calls, the vulnerabilities, the ways that new technologies are being integrated in ways that we don't fully understand yet, and can be very destabilizing and dangerous, people get it. And I think that there are opportunities. One of NTI's kind of big bets on narrative change is the culture space. And specifically, if we can, I think a light bulb moment went off for us when Oppenheimer came out and we saw the success of the film and we saw how many people were talking about it. $1 billion in worldwide sales, including China, just the number of people that saw that movie. Thinking through, if we could help influence storytelling about nuclear weapons in the cultural products that people consume in their everyday lives, that's huge. That is huge. And so we see now, nuclear weapons are something that are covered in film and TV. We have Fallout, we have The Diplomat, we have Paradise, we have movies coming out that have been announced. And if we can just help that story, if you can get people to consume something and they walk out of the theater and the only conclusion is no one should have nuclear weapons. Wow. Or I didn't realize that, or I'm going to learn more. That's a huge opportunity for us. And that's that can be a short-term gain. That could happen that could happen anytime.
Fantastic.
Plus
Yes,
one,
please.
that really just what I love about the human and machine fallibility point is like make the counter argument, right? Like how do you that's a winning argument in the way where I think a lot of times on these issues it comes down to things like that. Is like what do people ultimately hold in their head? They only have so much inventory in their brain on everything, right? So your issues can occupy this much space and make the counter argument. What we used to struggle with in the gun violence prevention movement in our theory of change was like the NRA had adages like nothing stops a bad guy with a gun but a good guy with a gun. And we're like, well, what about common sense policy like in purple states and like we could, reduce this, but like I didn't have a compelling counter argument to that, or that was that potent, So I think when you can find territories like that, that's a precious asset and repeat it ad nauseum. I think sometimes people get afraid of, oh, but I said that last time. Say it again and then say it again and then say it again because that's how stories stick is through repetition.
And I want to add just one thing too. I mentioned, we I think can erode that we can win on public opinion with stories of the system and close calls and things like that. But we can also, you mentioned at the beginning that Americans have a complex relationship with nuclear weapons and they see them as a necessary evil. But also, one of the reasons that they have that view is because they think it's impossible to make change. They see it as unlikely. And so, when you change the story from leaders in Russia and the United States signed treaties that reduced nuclear weapons. First of all, the fact that we reduced nuclear weapons by 80%, people are shocked. We stood in front of the Grove Mall with an installation around Oppenheimer Oscar weekend that said, "Make nukes history." And people kept coming up to us and going, "That'll never happen." And we were like, well, actually, we've reduced them by 80% already. And they're like, really? Wow. And I think when you change the story just from the US president and the Russian president to, well, 1 million people marched in Central Park in 1982, a film called The Day After, 100 million people saw it and it changed the conversation. Ronald Reagan saw it. Support for an arms buildup went to from 61% to 16% in a matter of 3 years. That's a different story. And that's something, I say this like in the mirror because NTI has not always been the best at telling that story in that way of the public's role and the progress, et cetera. So that's something that we're definitely taking away into our own work.
Fantastic. We're about to turn to audience for questions. So think of your questions, put your hand up and we'll have the roving mic. But one final question, and any panelist can answer this. What is one nuclear story? I think you've given us one, Elise, from history. But what's one nuclear story that you think needs to be told that might actually reach some of our current audiences that we want to reach?
Yeah, I might double down a little bit on Elise's point and just say telling the story of how the arsenals shrunk, I think is a really important story. And I think it actually really goes back to this question on movement building and working with adjacent movements, right? We know that the civil rights movement engaged with nuclear weapons issues. I saw a picture just the other day of Coretta Scott King holding an anti-nuclear sign, right? We know that there was a large movement of mothers saying this is not the world we should leave our children, right? And so I think telling that people power story is really key, and also working with movements, which I know some people in the space have, but also really investing real dollars and real staff time in bridge building with the movement for Black lives, right? I mean, that work has been done, but it's really nascent in this space, and there's not a lot of people doing it, and there's not a lot of money for it, and so that's what I'd have to say. Yeah.
Thanks, Mac. I think part of here is that we haven't had those resources to do this at scale. Now, I think we have both the will and the recognition of people in this field that we need to do it. We have a narrative guide with tools which give people assistance on how to do it, along with a whole lot of other studies. And I think what we need to do is really give ourselves that chance and to be able to try and see if we can do this at scale. Develop an awareness raising campaign that is really well supported, that is well coordinated and worked on with colleagues in this room who have a like-minded view of what needs to be done. So that's maybe a somewhat of a pitch for what we need. Let's go to audience members. Yes, down here, Ali. Oh, just wait for the microphone so everyone else can hear you, Ali. Thank you.
Hi, this is Ali Alkış from Turkey. And thank you for your insights. My question goes directly to Elise. It's about the Cranes for Our Future campaign. Every year I am joining and participating, and then every year I notice that there are more and more people are joining. So can you enlighten us about the impact that it's growing every year?
Yes, and I will also say your contributions to the Cranes for Our Future campaign have been some of my favorites over the years. Your daughter is very cute. So yeah, and actually this is one of the stories that I think people need to hear is the inspiration for the Cranes for Our Future campaign takes place every year around the commemorations of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. And we ask people to, it's a social digital campaign where we ask people to post on social media a photo of themselves or a graphic, but with a paper crane and their message about why they want a world without nuclear weapons. And it's inspired by the story of Sadako Sasaki, who I'll just briefly say was a girl who survived the Hiroshima bombing and tried to fold 1,000 cranes from her hospital bed when she got sick with radiation 10 years later. And she did not live, but her story and her hope for peace and for a better world kind of lives on, and she's inspired the world and her classmates. So it does feel like something that is growing, and that's why we created it, to see, could we get people engaged and just in this, like, make it more visible that the 77% that people want a world without nuclear weapons, giving people that opportunity to hope for it, to dream about it, to put it out there, to say it, is really special, and it's been extremely meaningful, I think, for all of us at NTI and those who have participated. So thank you so much for your participation.
Great. Another question down the back here.
Thank you. Raven Witherspoon with the Princeton Program on Science and Global Security. I was wondering what you think might be some untapped constituencies or maybe unlikely or unexpected allies in the nuclear movement where we haven't seen much effort or mobilization, but who may be really sympathetic to the issues.
I'm happy to take that. So some of our research that preceded this narrative project specifically, but I think built up to it, is we did some narrative and cultural research in 2021 and 2022, and found that there are these pockets of people who we call kind of persuadable audiences, and we looked at where they spend their time in the culture, how they interact with nuclear weapons. And I'll just give you one example of that, and that's gamers. As a core audience. So, as we think about culture, we've been thinking about like bespoke opportunities to like engage with the gaming community, obviously Fallout being one. And just thinking about like, are there ways, we've talked about like, could we do like a Twitch stream with like prominent gamers? So that's something that's definitely on our radar, and we're trying to figure out the best way to integrate that. But I mean, so that's like, I would say one cultural audience. I think there's also, I think it's like, we're still kind of hashing this out, I think, on where we think at NTI, one of our kind of like our mottos is like X in, exponential out. So like, where can we invest in a way that's gonna have exponential effects and impact? And so I think there are ways to look at whether we choose like business leaders or the faith community, like how can we kind of like engage in a way that could have ripple effects? And that's something I think that as a field, I think we're still making decisions on, which campaigns to choose that would reach those audiences.
One quick point to add, this is less about constituencies, more about allies, as we talked about like adjacent issues and how they intersect with nuclear weapons. We talk about the climate movement. I would encourage folks to be really attuned to scoreboards. Like what are the scoreboards that organizations and movements judge their success on? Because where those intersections lie is where there's opportunity. And I think if we look at climate, like I would want to understand, like what is the climate movement trying to accomplish right now where we could help accelerate their success? So on guns, I saw it with the mental health community because two-thirds of gun deaths are suicides. And the lethality of a suicide attempt with a gun is like 15, 20x any other method. So our interests were directly aligned. In working together, we could both support our goals. I think anytime you see that those goals start to deviate, I see less potential for something really meaningful to happen there. And I just really pay attention to and be very attuned to the scoreboards of movement.
I think that's, oh yes, Matt.
Oh yeah, just also to jump in, a couple of thoughts. One is that I think we talked a little bit about how much nuclear weapons cost, and I think folks engaged with money and politics in some way, and really the salience of this moment of, you know, this unelected mega billionaire Elon Musk, who's basically running our government for us, right? Like he's trying to get those Golden Dome contracts, right? Like he's getting SpaceX money, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think like money and politics, folks focused on like moving money, I think is really important. Indigenous movements who have always been deeply connected to climate and who have been impacted by uranium mining, for example. I think those are some of the spaces. And then especially young people who are already internationally engaged. When I worked in the anti-genocide movement, we had a lot of luck working with like model UN groups, right? Like either individually or sometimes institutionally, because those are some of already the most actively engaged young people talking about global issues that like do hit on nuclear weapons issues. So I think several spaces we could think about together.
Great, so some real practical suggestions of audiences and finding those very specific strategic points of mutual alignment. Yes, Gretchen.
Thank you. I'm Gretchen Hund. I'm the current chair of the Plowshares Board. And my question is, why do you think more has not been done in looking at these accidents? You've raised that, you know, with all these close calls. And I think that's what got me really motivated to join Plowshares, was really learning about, I mean, there's been so many. And how long can we all just kind of say, well, we've been really lucky. Lucky doesn't get me up in the morning and make me feel very good. So I just would love to hear your ideas about what can we do to kind of throw more energy into that.
I mean, maybe just to kick off, like, I think there's enormous value in storytelling around those cases. I think that could look different in different spaces, but I know my friend John Pope's in the corner over there. We just did a project together working with social media influencers around the doomsday clock, which we know is a high salience moment where the public is looking at nuclear weapons issues in a particular way. It happens every January. We can rely on it. Also really similar to the Hiroshima and Nagasaki anniversaries, like there's some sort of global attention at this moment on nuclear weapons issues. And it's an opportunity to do that sort of storytelling, to work with storytellers to maybe like plant some seeds so that they can talk to their audience about these issues. But I think if we do our job, I think, of kind of cultivating relationships with people who have an audience and have a following, those are the types of stories that we could really get out there and engage a public around.
Okay, let's move this gentleman here, and then Elise, if you want to.
Yeah.
My question is about the key disarmament story. So what is our key disarmament story? Today the world is more dangerous, and China and Russia are building more and better nuclear weapons. So our key disarmament story is we are better than them, we are not going to build them. Is this an effective common sense story for people? I don't think it works. Why can't our story be about finding common ground with Russia and China, about embracing them while keeping our democratic identity.
All right, very good question.
But in some way, can this be our story, and how do we shape this conversation?
Great. Who wants to take that one?
I'm happy to take that, and I think you segued right into it. So I think that the disarmament story and the story, I won't say it's the story, but I think it's a story that can start to lay the groundwork and shift us in the right direction. So this is an all of us issue. If a nuclear weapon goes off anywhere in the world, despite some of the conversations yesterday, it would have catastrophic consequences for everyone, for the way we live our lives, for the rule of law, for the global supply chain, et cetera. So when we are constantly interacting in the media, we are constantly, Russia did this, China did this, responding, and that's real. But the bottom line is that it is a planetary issue. It is an issue about humanity. And so we have to find ways to work together and find common ground. I think the point that a nuclear war can never be won and must never be fought, even people who agree on literally nothing else agree on that. So starting from there and recognizing that we are closer to that point than we have been definitely since the Cold War, to nuclear use, and maybe since 1945, it's necessary that we start to move into an all of us frame and recognize our shared security interests.
And I think you can toggle between an aspirational and a pragmatic. I think you can have an end game that could be very, very far off in the distance that is what you seek because there's no acceptable alternative. And then you can also come back to where we are now. Like on gun violence, we'd say, we can end gun violence, became a rally cry for the movement. In a country with 400 million firearms, that's not going to happen tomorrow. But there is no acceptable level of gun violence. So we set the end game as we created this, we can end it. It starts with, right? So it's like that ultimate end game that could be 100 years in the future, and here's where we start. I think that's an easy rhetorical device.
Yep.
And I'll maybe just quickly say, we're paying a lot of attention to this, and Rethink Media is putting a lot of time and energy into thinking about the question, particularly of U.S.-China relations, because it's gotten less attention, I think, in this field, but it's growing. Really, we're in a post-unipolar world, and that's something that U.S. policymakers kind of refuse to acknowledge or grapple with. But to me, that's part of the story that we have to tell is, right, we're in a world that is not the post-World War II order. We're in a world where we have, kind of growing nuclear arsenals. And the only way to actually have some sort of progress on these issues is to simmer the tensions, right? Like when we have a trade war with China, like that makes hot war more and more likely, which then makes nuclear weapons use more and more likely, right? And so I think that's something that sometimes the nuclear weapons community struggles with is how do we interact with conventional war issues that make nuclear weapons issues more and more likely? I think we need to tell a story about global cooperation and allowing other countries to thrive without, we can survive together and we can build a better world together, and we have to.
Fantastic. Well, I think the sign of a really good content discussion is that we've got more questions in the audience than we could answer. I didn't have to make up some on the fly because people were sitting there and not wanting to ask. So we're going to wrap up now, but I want to end by asking each of the panelists for one word, and I'm serious, one word, about how you are leaving today. How are you leaving this conversation when it comes to our ability to win? I'm going to start with Elise.
Hopeful.
Excellent. Jason.
Persistence.
Excellent again.
Resolved.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. I think we've resolved that this issue is very important. And please do, thank our panelists. Please go and get the resources at NTI's desk. It is very clear. There's a terrific 38-page report, but there's also a 2-page executive summary. And I think it helps us make the case that policy change is really built up a very different kind of actors in an ecosystem, right from idea generation to distillation of those ideas, socialisation of those ideas, and advocacy and engaging of constituents and publics who can pressure elected officials to make the right decisions. Hopefully that we can recognise more what we've really neglected, I think, for a while in this field, which is the importance of narrative, the importance of culture, of reaching people using data-driven research that we now have. And hopefully, as Mac had pointed out or suggested at the beginning, next time at NewtCon we won't be at 7:45, but we'll be part of the main stage, recognising that narrative and culture is a critical part of taking the ideas that people generate and creating long-lasting transformational change. So please join me in thanking again the panellists and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.